So a brief agenda for today's session. We're going to look at records management inside of Office 365, as well as how artificial intelligence helps records management. Then we're going to look into bridging the gap in records management, as well as how we can help, we being HELUX and Microsoft. And so before I introduce our speakers for today, I'll give you a bit of a background on myself and HELUX. So my name is David Balaki. I'm the Director of Marketing here at HELUX. HELUX is a Microsoft Gold partner in both application development and collaboration and content. We've recently been promoted to the highest tier of partnership in the Content Services Partner Program. We are now a preferred partner. And along with that, we've also been chosen, along with a handful of other companies, as a designated Project Cortex launch partner. HELUX has been in the professional consulting game for probably about 20 years now, covering the entire Microsoft stack with the sole goal of providing solutions that are friendly, simple, and powerful that ultimately maximize ROI in these technologies, such as M365 and Teams, as well as more recently with the addition of Microsoft's AI platform, Project Cortex, which surfaces and manages knowledge throughout your organization. And then more recently, in the last 5 years, we've begun to channel these years of expertise into a lineup of 3 truly groundbreaking products. The first one being Themis IA, which is an information architecture design deployment tool, and more recently Genesis AI, which is an auto classification and raw analysis tool, which is essentially a partner product or a company product to Project Cortex. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Dan Taillefer. Dan brings a rich history in providing information management and records management products and solutions to market. I consider him to be a true problem solver and definitely our in-house RM expert here at HELUX. And then there's Erica Telly. She is a multiple times Microsoft MVP, as well as a published author on M365 governance, compliance, and records management solutions. Typically, if I have questions regarding M365, she's the go-to, no questions asked. Both our speakers come to us with some pretty impressive resumes. They've both worked with small, medium businesses, as well as Fortune 500 companies, and helping them realize compliant RM solutions that fit their organizational requirements. And without further ado, I'll pass it off to Erica.
So before we dive into Microsoft 365 records management, it's important to understand Microsoft's view on the compliance platform. They view records management as one of several compliance solutions that's available in Microsoft 365 compliance. For example, we could do advanced e-discovery to meet the needs of internal investigations and litigation requests, communication compliance for supervision of messaging, information protection and data loss prevention to apply security to our content, insider risk management to monitor for insider risks, and then of course our full audit trail of all end user and administrative actions. So of course in Microsoft 365, we have the typical content you would expect, like SharePoint, Exchange, and Teams, but also Microsoft brings in and archives third-party data. For example, Slack messages, Zoom chats, or Bloomberg Instant Messenger. This is because in order to govern the information and apply records management principles to the information, it needs to be in Office 365. Microsoft 365 compliance does not manage content outside of Office 365, so we need these connectors to bring the data in for archive. Moving on to the Microsoft Records Management story. So this is an overview of every facet of the M365 records management solution. It's a lot, I know. But for this presentation, we're just going to focus on a couple of the key aspects, such as the retention labels and policies, how to automatically apply retention based on location or metadata and properties, and then how to use the manual application for end users. So there's really 2 building blocks of retention in Microsoft 365. Those are the retention label and the retention policy. So both of these apply retention. You can use them together. You don't have to choose one or the other, and they commingle. But record labels have event-based retention. So if you want to do event-based retention, you need to use a label. You also need to use a label if you want to have your content be immutable to prevent it from being modified or deleted. For both of them, you can automatically apply retention based on sensitive information types, properties, or using the new compliance trainable classifiers, which are machine learning models to help you identify content and apply the right retention label. Retention labels also allow you to get really granular and tag specific documents, whereas retention policies apply retention at the container level. So either an entire SharePoint site or an entire Exchange mailbox as an example. And then lastly, if you want to do a disposition review, you need to use a retention label. So now let's go ahead and look at how the settings for these labels and policies and how they work. This is an example of creating a retention policy. So it has what you would expect. You can set the ability to retain content for a certain number of days, months, years, or forever. You can retain the content based on the creation date or the modified date to trigger retention. On the flip side, you could use a retention policy to force deletion of content. So as an example, some people don't want to have their team's messages sitting around for longer than 3 months. We would use a retention policy to enforce that 3-month deletion. Retention policies also have the flexibility to apply retention to multiple locations. If it's in Office 365, then we can manage it. We also can use the include or exclude option. As an example, if you're using a capstone approach to Exchange email management, meaning that you're applying a broad retention policy to your organization, but then have specific users that need to have a longer retention period on their email. You can do that using these retention policies and then including people in the policy for the longer retention period that need to have the longer retention. This is an example of how to manually apply a retention label. You can use the locations to deploy the labels so they're available to end users. They apply the labels manually as metadata. But we all know that a lot of times end users don't end up tagging things, or when they do, it's not really the correct designation. And so that's why the remainder of this presentation will be focused on how to leverage artificial intelligence and auto labeling to make sure that you're in compliance with your records program. Just another note on the differences between retention labels and retention policies. Retention labels can only manage content in Exchange email mailboxes, SharePoint sites, OneDrive account, Microsoft 365 groups, and newly launched this month, labels can manage Teams meeting recordings. If you want to manage Teams chats and channel messages as an example, then you'll need to use a retention policy. This makes sense because you don't want to tag each individual chat. Instead, you want to apply a retention policy to an entire team or all Microsoft Teams. Here's a first example for how we can automatically apply content. This is an example of setting a retention label on a specific document library. When we upload content to this document library, it'll automatically be tagged with the correct retention label. So to set this up, go to your document library settings, click on Apply Label to Items in this list or library, and then you can select from the retention labels that have been deployed to that site. Also note that you can apply a default retention label at the folder or document set level, and it'll trickle down to all the documents that are inside that folder or document set. This seems to be a very simple slide, but it's actually one of the most powerful tools in Microsoft 365 Records Management. This feature allows us to use document properties to automatically apply retention labels. Well, what does that mean? Let's say that you have set up your information architecture in Microsoft 365 and you're using content type, which are information architecture kind of pivot point to designate what are status reports. All your client status reports need to be kept for 3 years, only if they've been marked as final. We can use the property content type and the metadata field status in order to apply the 3-year retention policy. You can do this with any of the properties available in SharePoint or other areas of Office 365. And how do we enforce the information architecture structure that we need in order to make this auto application consistent and accurate? Well, that's why we would recommend a tool that does site provisioning and maintains your information architecture, making sure that your content types are applied to the right documents and the right libraries, and that your metadata is consistent. We can do this using a site template. For an example, if we have a project site, in the project site, we can have a document library for deliverables. We've pushed the content type for status reports and for client presentations to the deliverables library using the site template. We've also added our column for status. So when we've applied the report content type and the status is a draft, we'll just retain it for 1 year because it was never given to a client. But when its status equals final, we want to retain it for 3 years per our company policy and then do a disposition review and approval before it's deleted. We make all of this happen using the auto application based on properties that we saw in the previous slide. So this is a summary of what we just went over for Microsoft 365. There's two types of retention, policies and labels. When you deploy your retention policies, you can implement them based on content properties or location, and then you can apply the policy or label to the site level or the file level. And then when you want to apply retention, you really have three options. First, manually having the end users tag the content. Second, using business processes or structure to populate content types and metadata, and maybe using Power Automate to have a workflow that enforces this. And then finally is the third way, which is artificial intelligence. This is where we use rules and machine learning to identify content and apply the right retention policy. And that's something that we'll focus on in the remainder of the presentation. We've gone over the basics of how Microsoft 365 records management works. But how does this measure up against an advanced records management scorecard? Dan, do you have some thoughts?
I do indeed. Thank you, Erica. Very interesting hearing everything that SharePoint has to offer. So as we can see here on our record card, records management really is a discipline that has many facets, some of which are listed here. And not everything in this list is really going to matter to an organization necessarily. And quite frankly, not every offering in the market may have all of these features. The one thing that I really want to impress upon you is that for most of the items that are in this list, if you think about it slightly differently, they either depend on metadata to either push a rule or to define a process or to identify some sort of artifact. And that's what I really want to talk about, is a kind of another facet that is directly related to records management, because records management can be kind of viewed as the downstream controller. But if you want to do things upstream, you have to think about the upstream events first. Otherwise, you're going to have some difficulty with your RM program. So if you want just to circle back to kind of the title of this presentation, it's all about harnessing the power of AI, so automated intelligence, to improve your RM program. And HELUX can help you in a number of ways. And I wanted to kind of discuss some of the offerings that we do have that we think are really going to matter. Governance and records management is always about people, process, and technology. So the people and process, that's never going to change. That's always going to be required for change management. It's always going to be required for certain types of records, vital records, where people have a big play. They might manually tag this information. They know exactly what they have. They know exactly where it belongs. However, with the volumes of information that we have today, it is not very pragmatic to be able to tag data and extract metadata from content by having the content creators look at it and inspect it. And the records managers aren't going to do it either, because quite frankly, they're responsible for managing the content, but 99.99% of the content wasn't created by them. It was created by content creators. These are the people playing in the middle here. With technology, SharePoint has recently helped out with the technology bit, and we have also have an ability to help with extracting metadata, and not only just getting metadata extracted automatically through, as we will see later, how that's actually done. We have the ability to do some raw analysis, so that's redundant, outdated, and trivial analysis of the information. You might have duplicates and triplicates in your system. Now, what is the system? Well, the system could be a file share, or the system could actually be SharePoint itself. And we'll kind of get back to that a little bit later. So these bookends we feel are really important. Why? Because, well, they essentially were there to control the chaos. So you want something that you can govern so that after it looks a little bit more logical. Now, with artificial intelligence, that's just a single play. Another very important play to this, before you even get to the artificial intelligence, is your information architecture. So what is information architecture, and why are we talking about it, and why would this even be important? And how does it play with the AI? The information architecture is extremely important in SharePoint because a SharePoint site is extremely easy to create. In a couple of clicks, you can create it, but it really has nothing in it. It doesn't have metadata, content types, taxonomies. It may not have even created multiple libraries to store different types of information. There is a lot to do in terms of getting an architecture in SharePoint up and running and going. And then there's updating that information architecture. So you have it all set up, Perhaps you've done it through PowerShell. Perhaps you have some people on site that that are SharePoint developers that were able to do this. That can be very helpful, but the problem is it's a bit of a disconnected process. So what we looked at is if you make your repository of record a dumping ground and no better than a glorified file share, SharePoint has a lot more to offer. And so this is a piece that you need in place in order to get the proper tags and metadata and structure in place first so that you can get artificial intelligence to work for you. And we'll see that here on the next couple of slides. So the one thing that we do offer to help you along this path is Themis IA. So IA is for information architecture. And what really this helps you do is it centralizes the creation and the provisioning of SharePoint sites so that you can provision metadata, taxonomy information, content types, lists, libraries, all of that information, and cut your deployment time in a centralized way. And so it really kind of changes the paradigm, because if you think about kind of the old way, or sometimes I call this the no way, and the no way is just, let's just spin up a site and that's it, we're done. The old way could also be, well, we know that we can't just spin up a site. There has to be some information about this site. There needs to be metadata, content types, all of that good stuff. However, normally with this, how this is done is through a bunch of experts that get together, a highly specialized team. They require their gatherments. They usually do this in Excel or some other form, and then they route the thing, and then they go, and it can be slow and tedious, and quite frankly, a little bit costly. Well, our way is essentially, why not just do this in a centralized location? Why not do this so that I can create reports, visual reports that shows me exactly what I'm building? And then why can't I not just route those reports around for approval? And then once they're approved, I can provision the site and I'm off to the races. And so I can have consistency. And here's the key. It's consistency of metadata, consistency of taxonomy, consistency and rapid deployment to get you up and running, so that you could use artificial intelligence and you can use downstream things like records management and other things as well, like the Power Automate platform, the Power Platform from Microsoft, to kind of help you along your journey. So what does this kind of look like? Here's just a screenshot of our site design. As you can see here, this is a site. Underneath, you can create essentially all of the libraries, all of the lists. You can add, as you can see here, content types. You can do some funky things like disabling folder creation. You could use, enable versioning, do permissions. It does the full gamut of all of the settings that you could possibly think of in SharePoint, but it does it in a centralized way. It records it all centrally. And the really nice part about it is that you see an overview of what you're about to create in SharePoint. And it shows you the lists, the libraries, the folders, if you're using folders and subfolders that you're creating. Not only that, however, here's the nice part. It shows you the content types that you're using, all of the properties, whether they're required, the default values, if there are any, as well as if you're using managed metadata. This is a list of terms, of fixed terms. It could be open as well. You can have an open list. It could show the values. So this is what you could route. So you could save this to PDF, route this along. You can even use some of the SharePoint tools to route it out in SharePoint through Power Automate, for example, to route this, and so that you can essentially spin up a site and you know exactly what you have. And if you need to make a single change to, let's say, a content type, you can update multiple sites that use that reference content type. So IA, we think, can certainly help you with your journey to essentially put information in SharePoint in an organized way. And so it's a no-code solution. So you do not have to be a SharePoint architect or a developer. You don't have to know PowerShell to be able to use this tool. So a business user can use it, and it can configure many things in SharePoint: folders, lists, views, the menus, and security groups, and a whole lot more. And so it can also update. So if anybody ever made a change in SharePoint, for example, they added managed metadata outside of Themis IA, we have the ability to pull that information in so that we're all consolidated, so that we have the same set of information. So these are reusable components that we feel are very important. So as I said, this is a piece to the puzzle. The other piece to the puzzle is something that Microsoft released at the beginning of this month. So they've got a group or a suite of products that will be coming out, and this falls under the name of Project Cortex. The first product, official product that was released at the beginning of October this month was something called SharePoint Syntax. And so this is essentially uses artificial intelligence in order to categorize and to tease and pull out metadata from content. It enables you to understand your content. Project Cortex is a bigger beast on its own, and it also has something called shared topics and topics that kind of surface and bubble up information and knowledge, all in an automated way to users that are in the M365 platform. And it can show some of these topics and topic cards in kind of the products you use every day, things like Teams and Microsoft Word and others, and Outlook. That's not really what we're going to be talking about today, and that's also not yet released, but we will be talking about SharePoint Syntax because it has the downstream effects of enhancing your compliance program. So you're using artificial intelligence to be able to extract metadata automatically and to be able to use that because most of these systems are rules-based. And to create a rule, what are you using? Metadata. And so if you can extract some of this automatically without all of your users having to tag information manually, now that doesn't mean that your users won't do that. You can absolutely have it both ways. And that's the point of having a good information architecture. You could segment your environment in SharePoint for vital records, for example, that you know what the information is. You know they need to be tagged a certain way. The users are trained and they will tag those appropriately. Or you could have other information that's more transient in nature, or that information that can be kept with a rule that is a lot easier to put together. So if we look at what syntax is, it's basically about document understanding. So document understanding is really enriched data. So if you think about it, there's really 4 big brackets here of things that you could perhaps want to tease information out of. You can do it the manual way. So that's content where you have your information architecture in place, you have managed metadata terms, for example, and you have users adding tags to the information. You could do an object detection. So this is for items that are very well known. Business cards, pictures, you can OCR and text them, and you could have some pre-built automated ways of teasing out that information and getting it in the system. Or the last 2 buckets, if you have content that is structured, like an invoice, for example, or a purchase order, you could have AI, so artificial intelligence, recognize the data in the form and be able to take that data out and put it as metadata in SharePoint. So it's surfaced in a column in SharePoint. And that's really important because you could use that for other things. Well, and then there's probably the vast majority, which is of information could land in your into the document understanding piece. And this is really for documents that perhaps change constantly. They're not structured. So you want to use machine learning in order to essentially capture the content from it. So you're teaching it what to understand out of the content. And Microsoft makes this fairly simple, and so that you can do a document understanding. And this is really what syntax is all about. Because syntax takes those last 2 pieces of forms processing, so this is structured data like an invoice or a purchase order as you see here, and it can automatically recognize the fields. So the price, the amount of tax that was paid, the customer, the date, and it can create what's called a model. Think of a model as kind of a template. And this template can be used in a single library. And so the minute that you put purchase orders in that library in SharePoint, this information is extracted automatically. That relieves the end users the burden of trying to figure out what all of this information is. You can pull it out automatically. Now, the other form here is document understanding. And the document understanding is for documents that may change with time, may change with the customer. You may have certain elements in the document, but they're in different locations or they're in different contexts. And so what you do is you train the system by giving it some example documents. You also give it some negative examples. And what you do is you train it to create a model. The model will be able to classify the document. So if you think of classification like attaching a content type to it, for example, and you can also extract the metadata because you're creating all of this in the model. And this model can be applied to multiple libraries. And so that when content arrives in the library, no matter how you did it, you could have dragged and dropped it, you could have imported it, you could have done it programmatically. When it arrives in the libraries, essentially the model wakes up and says, oh, and there could be several models in the library, but the model can wake up and go, oh, what is this? Let me have a look at it. Oh, I understand exactly what this content is, or this is a negative example, I don't understand what this is. Then essentially, if it understands what it is, it will extract the metadata accordingly. And if it does not, well, then the metadata is not extracted. It's fairly simple. Why are we talking about syntax? Why are we talking about this? Well, Genesis AI is a product from HELUX that we can take advantage of SharePoint syntax to offer another piece of that bookend. So the other piece of that bookend was you've got duplicates, you have redundant, outdated, and trivial information. You've got a corpus of data that you would like to put into SharePoint, or you have data that's already in SharePoint, but the problem is that when you first implemented SharePoint, you didn't think about content types and metadata and doing everything. You just basically created a library, you put everything in the library, and you said, well, that's it. Well, Genesis AI can help with that problem as well for existing data or for data, let's say, in a file share. So you have data in a file share or existing data in SharePoint that's really not classified appropriately. Not only do you want to classify it, you want to tease out the metadata. You can do this with Genesis AI because what it does is that it allows you to cull the information first. It allows you to classify it. Now, it can classify it using our model that we provide to classify the data. And so this is an AI model that we have, or you can use the AI models that you have trained in SharePoint syntax for that. So you've trained these models that will use the syntax models. And what we can do is route that information with routing rules on metadata to an appropriate library. And once they're in the library, if, for example, the syntax was applied to that library, the metadata gets teased out. What does this kind of look like in just a very high level approach? Well, you start with the ingestion. So the ingestion could be on a file share. It could actually be in a SharePoint library itself. As I said, perhaps you just dumped everything in there and you said, we'll worry about it later. Or perhaps you didn't realize the importance of metadata because you weren't thinking about having a federated records management program, or you didn't want to do automation through Power Automate and other things that can use metadata to do things in an automated fashion. The first step is pretty simple. It's you're going to identify your content. So what do you want to migrate? Then you're going to filter out all of the rot. So the duplicates, we can do that automatically. You might filter out data by its age. You may say that if you're doing a file share, you have data for certain extensions that aren't relevant. So in your file share, it might have any files and it might have system or configuration files. And so you want to remove kind of all of the trivial stuff, the duplicates, triplicates, and then essentially enrich the content from there. And enriching the content is really the key, is that you want to use syntax AI models for that, classify. We've got a classification model as well to do part of that and to extract the metadata, and the rules can route the information. And so once the information is routed, it can be migrated and it can live in its new home. And the idea is that the new home is a lot better than the old home, which was just a dumping ground. Enriching data with metadata, why? There are some other downstream factors as well that if you have good metadata, it makes for an improved search. For example, in the M365 platform, users spend way too much time searching. This is well known. Yes, you can get results back quickly, but if the results aren't relevant, it's not going to help you. And so having data and metadata is very important for that. It's also better for adoption. So if you have metadata in your libraries and you have information that's tagged, you can filter, you can sort, you can group them all on metadata. And so this is a really powerful technique that Microsoft SharePoint has out of the box, because this really reduces the need for creating all these nested libraries or creating subsites of a subsite and creating this very complex structure of folders that you have 10 folders deep, you can replace most of that with metadata. And so getting metadata out is really important. Also using it for a workflow or for automation. So you can take advantage of the Power Platform in SharePoint. This is built in. So these are things you should take advantage of. And metadata is a biggie. Metadata, obviously, for tagging content. So you can create specific metadata for your organization using an information architecture tool. So it's guaranteed to meet your business needs, and it's going to be consistent across your entire SharePoint ecosystem. And that it can enrich third-party record products along with the built-in capabilities of records management for SharePoint itself, because as Erica showed you, you can create an automated rule, for example, that uses metadata to apply a label. And so if you have metadata that's extracted automatically, you could get then now the rule to apply. This kind of takes us to the kind of digital transformation journey, which is kind of a long winding path all the way down from unstructured data to essentially, empowering your knowledge users and helping them all along the way. HELUX, we're here to help. We think that for many of the facets that are shown on this road, that we can certainly help your organization with our solutions along the way so that you take full advantage of the licenses. So you're using the M365 platform, you're paying for a license, why not extract and get the most out of those licenses by using the metadata and some of the tools that are available, or some additional tools that can certainly help you along the way on your digital transformation journey.